Sometimes you just need to be even more objectively correct than you were before. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. So what is it that we're doing today? Well, previously we did a tier list covering what I felt was the best to worst stories in Fire Emblem due to the fact that people were sharing some meme lists of it on Twitter, and it looked like it'd be a fun time to do a little bit of a serious one. People took it a little bit more seriously than maybe they needed to and got a wee bit heated in the comments, but it is what it is. So it goes. I kind of expected that, given as how I have some what I know to be controversial takes about Fire Emblem story and its writing. But today we're going to be talking about gameplay instead, the raw, day-to-day strategic experience of the Fire Emblem series. It's the reason that I fell in love with the series, and I imagine the reason that so many of you did as well. And we're going to go through and rank, once again, from S to D, the best to the worst. As always, seeing as how I've not actually played Fire Emblems 1 through 3 in their original releases, I've dropped them into their own tier in the never played tier. I cannot pass judgment on that which I have not played. And we're going to go right through in not necessarily like chronological release order, but at least in terms of Fire Emblems 1 through yada, yada, yada. So, starting right off, it's Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. Much like how I said Shadow Dragon represents kind of a baseline for what Fire Emblem should be. It's not bad, but it's nothing special either. I feel like in terms of its gameplay, Shadow Dragon is a solid C. Compared to what the series does now, it's not the most interesting experience. It's quite bare bones with things like the weapon triangle and criticals and linear class progression being really all that it has on offer, but it's still a fun experience. If you enjoy turn-based strategy gaming, if you enjoy the Fire Emblem formula, playing around with the weapon triangle, leveling Myrmidons and mercenaries and axe fighters and knights and Pegasi riders and mages and all that type of fun stuff, it's going to have all of that here for you. And something that is nice about Shadow Dragon is the fact that it is a very digestible, quick, casual experience. If you're not playing on like Lunatic 5 or whatever, you can breeze through the game pretty easily and just get some nice, simple strategy gaming in there. And when you've got modern entries like Engage, where you have a lot of in-depth character building, side missions, stuff to do in the Somniel, figuring out what upgrades to put on who, with what emblems on what characters and what engravings on what weapons, it's nice to be able to just go in, drop a silver sword on somebody, and go to town, right? If you're looking for just a raw Fire Emblem gameplay experience, you can't go wrong with Shadow Dragon. I think it is a solid middle-of-the-road B. Moving on to Shadows of Valencia Echoes, the remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden. This is one that I know people tend to be a little bit more wishy-washy about, largely due to the differences in mechanics that Gaiden introduced to the series and often never saw use again, that Echoes, for the sake of being faithful to the original, retained, as well as some gameplay maps that people don't particularly enjoy because they're basically just like open fields and cavalry charges and everything. But I appreciate Echoes for what it does differently. The fact that Echoes does stand apart from the rest of the series and shows that they were trying some new stuff with Gaiden. They weren't afraid to switch it up a bit, and they weren't afraid to be faithful to that with Echoes, makes it really enjoyable. I don't think it's like the most fun game in the series, but some of the things like unbreakable weapons, having to choose to equip like a healing item or whatever, having explorable dungeons, the different types of classes that you have going on, the fact that it's our first instance of a split campaign with two heroes in Alm and Celica, there's a lot of cool stuff in Echoes. Hell, just the fact that your mages cast from their HP, right? Or you can use special abilities based off of your character's HP, and as such, balancing how much HP you have and having good healing on hand is really important so you can use your best stuff. I think that does make it a lot of fun. And I'm not someone who's ever really been bothered by the open maps either. Like, yeah, you know, sometimes you're just going to be in an open field with cavalry charging down on you. How do you deal with that? That's real life, baby. That's how a lot of combat was back in the day. So to me, it's cool to see that in something like Fire Emblem, where otherwise we have a lot of very intricately designed maps with chokeholds and different places where you're maybe in a castle and there's a lot of narrow corridors and doors you have to unlock and everything like that. It's weird to imagine a knight galloping down one of those hallways lancing people, but out on an open field. That's very different. So for those reasons, I actually want to put Echoes in A. I know there's probably going to be a lot of people that disagree with that, but I really do enjoy it, and it's a game that I've played through multiple times now because it just offers such a unique take on Fire Emblem while still very much being Fire Emblem flavored, and I appreciate that. Moving on to Fire Emblem 3, New Mystery of the Emblem, and if Shadow Dragon is a B, I really don't think I can put New Mystery anywhere other than an A. It's not my favorite combat experience at all. It's basically just Shadow Dragon, but with a lot more interesting maps, a much higher difficulty curve, and just more interesting types of units in general to play around with. Shadow Dragon introduced all of the archetypes that we know now. Your Jagans, your Navars, your different types of healers, your S, your Kashuas, all that type of stuff. And it's just fun. Like, it's just fun to have those archetypes at hand, but then to see how they evolved in New Mystery and actually having some play with things, having different types of characters in a way that we've only seen evolve over the course of the series history, experiencing kind of what that started as in this third entry in the series was awesome, and I think it really brings to the fore how much you can do with Fire Emblem's overall simple formula if you just put your mind to it. It's a great experience. I very much enjoy it. It's a solid A tier. Genealogy of the Holy War. Much like how this was in my S tier for story, I think it has to be in S tier for gameplay. And again, there's probably going to be a lot of people that disagree with that, but I love how grand each mission is in Genealogy. I know it's technically only like 11 missions because each individual map is so huge and relatively in-depth. It would be a lot faster, so the animations were faster and all that type of stuff, but, you know, that's limitations of hardware. I get that. But just being able to go in and feel like you're actually waging a proper campaign, seizing territory, taking different castles, having story events happen once you do take different castles, needing to have someone to defend a said castle, literally stationed in it, being able to play around in the actual castle town, go to the arena, buy items, promote your units. It's, again, much like Echoes, a very different take on the Fire Emblem formula, and it's so good for it. Is it dated? Yeah, absolutely. The fact that Genealogy is the first entry on this list that is actually not a remake or anything like that and has to be judged based solely on the experience of the original release back on the Super Nintendo, that could hurt it, but I'm trying to look at things objectively here. What Genealogy does as a Super Nintendo game is crazy. It's so interesting to see what they pulled off. And to this day, I think it is a very solid, very fun strategy experience and an absolute must-play if you're a Fire Emblem fan. Cannot recommend it enough. The fact that you can build super powerful characters by passing down holy blood, figuring out how you're going to actually build your second generation of units, what weapons they're going to inherit, all that type of fun stuff. The arena, promoting your units, seeing who's actually going to even be able to make it to promotion because otherwise it might just not be strong enough to get enough experience during the campaign. It's so much fun. I love it. And it's where we saw a lot of Fire Emblem staples come into play. It's where we first saw the skills that we know and love now, like Soul, Luna, Astra. It's where we first saw some of our major instances of a variety of different holy legendary weapons with incredibly powerful, in Genealogy, incredibly busted, status effects, stat boosts on them, all that type of fun stuff. It's just such a good experience. I cannot praise it enough. Genealogy is S tier. Moving on to Fire Emblem 5, Thasia 776. This is one that I think might be one of the most divisive because of the challenges that it introduced and some of the mechanics that it utilizes that are definitely a little clunky, a little weird, and I think for good reason, perhaps, we're never really seen in the series again. There's one instance we'll talk about in regards to Fates. But I kind of love it for its clunky weirdness. It's not an S rank, not at all, because Thasia is definitely an awkward game to play, and the number of times during my one run of it that I've done where I got caught off guard by something that just is a weird mechanic that I wasn't really thinking about in my moment-to-moment play, and kind of was in a, am I screwed? Do I need to restart this run kind of mindset? was significant. This happened like 3 or 4 different times. The fact that if you have Leaf escape a map before the rest of his units on certain maps where you have to escape, they'll just be captured and be gone until you can rescue them at a later point in the story. Or the fact that units will just run out of stamina and not be deployable for a given map. Like, you need to plan for that. If you go into a tough map and some of your best units aren't able to be used, it might be unwinnable for you. The fact that there's next to no money to be had except for capturing enemy units and taking their weapons and selling it. Again, really interesting, and it really drives home that scrappy, we are a small, barely duct-taped together resistance fighting off a far more powerful enemy. It really brings that atmosphere home. But when you're just trying to play a Fire Emblem game, it can be really, really, really jarring. Leadership stars, really high power enemies, really tough bosses, the Reinhardt. I love Thasia because it's such a weird beast, in much the same way that I love Echoes for being a weird beast and just trying a bunch of different stuff. But unlike Echoes, a lot of those systems don't feel as refined as they could be to really make the gameplay flow. So as much as I really enjoy it, I don't think I can put Thasia any higher than a B. It's fun, but it's clunky, and it's just kind of a little too awkward to be up there with the best. So I think B is where I'm going to put it. It doesn't offend me in any way, like some entries on this list kind of do a little bit. But yeah, I think B is the best place for this one. Next up is Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade of Roy fame. And this, I think, is actually going to be our first C rank entry, which is really a shame. But it feels right, and I'll explain why. I love Binding Blade for a lot of reasons. I love it for being the sequel in terms of story to Fire Emblem 7. I love it for having a lot of my favorite characters, including Roy, represented in it. I love the story that it presents of actually having to unlock all of the secret missions to get all of the legendary heroic weapons and have all of them on you to unlock the actual final couple of missions to go beat the big bad, get the good ending. And seeing characters like Zephiel as not just evil for the sake of evil, but truly having deep-seated trauma driving their decision-making makes Fire Emblem 6 one of the greats in my mind until I go to play it. And then it just feels like such an unrefined version of 7 and 8. It was the first title that came out on the Game Boy Advance. It was the first title where they dropped a lot of the mechanics that they'd been experimenting with in previous entries, like skills and whatnot, and really honed in on a tight, focused set of features and characters that we really didn't know what Fire Emblem was really going to be until the GBA era. 1 through 5 tried so many different things. And 6 is where they really kind of picked a set number of things like supports, the weapon triangle, specific types of character classes, and the way maps would be set up, and they ran with it for quite a while. And it turned Fire Emblem into what we love, but man, 6 is just awkward. Some of the route splits just being blatantly more difficult than the other, some of the characters just being absolutely dog tier in terms of combat effectiveness, the fact that Roy is locked out of his promotion until the last, fifth of the game, the fact that it's so easy to miss some of the legendary weapons, the fact that all the legendary weapons only have 20 uses and break so easily if you're not careful with them, despite being these godly artifacts, some of the map designs, it gets boring and tedious trying to get some of these characters, trying to get some of these objectives in a way that really few, if any, of the other Fire Emblems are for me. So compared to its brethren on the GBA, and especially some of the others that are going to be on this list in terms of just other games in the series, I don't think Binding Blade is that good. And it really pains me to say, because I love Roy and I love his story, but I think C rank is where it's got to sit. Fortunately, though, we are moving on into the rest of the GBA era with Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade, the story of Eliwood, Lyn, and Hector. And, I mean, I think this has got to be an A tier, right? It takes everything that the baseline of Shadow Dragon set up at the very beginning of the series. It takes all of the features and gameplay mechanics and design choices of 6, and it elevates it to such a level. There's a reason that Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, I think, is many people's favorite Fire Emblem. There's a reason, I think, why they brought it as the first entry in the series to the West. And I think it's one of the biggest reasons that so many people are here talking about the series today. Fire Emblem 7 is a landmark in the series. And while it doesn't quite have the same pizzazz or panache that would put things like Genealogy in S tier or some of the other games that we're going to put in S tier up there, it is a really good experience. If you want to just burn through some fun, casual Fire Emblem gameplay, Eliwood's story is the way to go. If you want something way more challenging, way more involved, but still basic Fire Emblem at its core, Hector's mode, especially Hector Hard mode, is the way to go. There's so many fun characters, so many different ways you can build out a party, a lot of interesting maps, and a decent variety of different types of gameplay objectives, a good variety of weapons. It's just a fun time. I mean, look at how many people have spent so long making ROM hacks based on Fire Emblem 7. Look at for how long people were doing low turn count runs of Fire Emblem 7, and still are to this day. It's just a phenomenal experience. I can't get enough of it. I truly think it's one of the greats. And if it just had a little bit more going on, then I think it would be S rank. Moving on to Fire Emblem 8, The Sacred Stones. Now, it should be well known at this point that The Sacred Stones is one of my favorite entries in the series. It is my first entry that I ever played, and it holds a special place in my heart as a result. So, I'm going to try to not be too biased here. Some bias is inevitable. Sacred Stones is an A tier. If The Blazing Blade is A tier, I think Sacred Stones has to be as well. And for the same reasons that 7 is not S tier, Sacred Stones is not S tier. There's so much more that can be done with the Fire Emblem formula that we had seen previously with things like Genealogy, Echoes, Thasia 776. They could have done more, and they chose not to, and that's fine, because it made for such a solid, focused experience, but it doesn't quite push it over into S tier. That said, Sacred Stones does so much that's so cool. Having the split narrative with 2 protagonists like Echoes, having a creature campaign in the post-game where you can run around and fight some pretty nasty battles with your uber-powerful team and really test their mettle after you finished the story. Having not 1, but 2 dungeons that you can go into, and the Lagdao Ruins being pretty damn tough, where you really have to focus your tactical mindset and work hard to get through. Having branching promotion paths, having 3 trainees with unique classes. There's so much that went into Sacred Stones that showed that Intelligent Systems had been paying very close attention to what they were doing with 6 and 7, since they were also on the GBA, and then just took all of that experience and swung for the fences. It's a phenomenal experience. It, to me, is one of the best entry points in the series for a new player to jump in and check it out and just see what raw Fire Emblem is all about. I can't get enough of it. It does everything that Fire Emblem 7 does, if not better. It's great. It's an A-rank game. If you haven't played Sacred Stones, if you're a newer fan who maybe started with like Fates, Three Houses, Engage, I implore you, check it out. I think you'll enjoy it. For Fire Emblem 9, Path of Radiance, this is where we moved back to consoles for the first time in quite a while, a whole generation of games that were on the Game Boy Advance with mobile gaming. And Fire Emblem 9 does what I wish they had either had the courage to do, or maybe just weren't limited by technology the way they were. I don't really know why the decisions that were made to exclude certain features that we'd seen in the games previously from the GBA series, but where some of those features were brought back. If 7 and 8 are A rank, I think Path of Radiance has to be S, because it does everything that the GBA era did at its peak and more. really the only thing that I can say that Path of Radiance doesn't do that the GBA games had was branching promotion paths. You only have one choice when it comes to what you're going to promote characters into. And granted, it was only Sacred Stones that did that, and until things like Awakening came along. But other than that, we saw the return of skills from Genealogy and Thasia. We saw a really tight experience of the way the weapon triangle was handled. We saw awesome, very interesting creative maps, a lot of unique character types in terms of not just what classes there were, but what archetypes of characters there were within those classes, where very few characters felt truly useless. And in fact, we saw a lot of pre-promotes that were really fun to use. And I mean, I think of like Titania as just a solid ass unit for the whole game. We saw the introduction of the Laguz, the first time that we had a proper transformation mechanic that wasn't just someone who was billed as a Manakete and had a Dragonstone and that was just their attack, but it actually being a transformation that happened and you had to manage in battle, that as the character flowed between their two different forms, their humanoid form and their beast-like form, actually needed to change the way that you approached battle with that in mind. There was just so much that was done so well with Path of Radiance. And again, much like Sacred Stones, I think it's one of the best entry points for someone who's never played a Fire Emblem before to just jump in and get the raw experience of what the series has to offer. Again, barring like maybe like a branching campaign like Sacred Stones, or again, like Sacred Stones, split promotion path idea, Path of Radiance just has everything. And it's so good. And I crave that era of simplicity to a certain degree in Fire Emblem. I don't know that we'll ever get it again, but God, I love it. Path of Radiance is an S tier, bar none. And I don't know that there's that many people that are going to disagree with me on that. Or if they do, I can't imagine you putting it any lower than A tier. That would just be... It would be crazy to see it lower than A tier, but, you know, go off. I'm sure there's going to be someone in the comments, so have at it. Moving on to Fire Emblem 10 Radiant Dawn, the sequel to Path of Radiance. This is one that I know tends to get under people's skin a bit more. There's a few reasons as to why. The biorhythm system, very divisive, far more impactful in Radiant Dawn than it was in Path of Radiance. In Path of Radiance, it was very easy to just not realize that it was a system at all, whereas in Radiant Dawn, it is very hard to not notice that it is a system. The fact that the English difficulties were kind of messed up compared to the Japanese difficulties, so like hard mode was insanely brutal, and there was a lot of kind of discrepancy in people's experience as a result. The fact that you have the 4, not even branching narratives, but the 4 consecutive campaigns that played into one another, but that introduced entirely different parties, entirely different characters that you had to level and manage, and different inventories that you had to grow accustomed to and everything. There was a lot that I know people dislike about Radiant Dawn, but fortunately, this is my tier list. And I love Radiant Dawn. I went through a period of my life where I would play Path of Radiance and then Radiant Dawn back to back. Because if you didn't know, you can actually transfer your save data over from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn if you have it on a memory card. And I did. I played both games on the Wii, and you can have a GameCube memory card in the Wii. Like 2 times a year, maybe 3. Like on summer break, on winter break, and then like maybe one time during the school year, depending on if I was talking about high school, college, whatever. And I just couldn't get enough. I just could not get enough. There's so many different characters to level, especially with Radiant Dawn. So many characters between returning characters from Path of Radiance, new characters to Radiant Dawn, different ways you could build your parties out, different types of unit combinations that you could utilize, different ways that you could apply skills. There's just something about it that is so engaging. I think part of that is because of the fact that the campaign is broken up into 4 distinct parts. You know, you start with the Dawn Brigade, and then you go to the Knights of Crimea, and then to Ike and his mercenaries, and then kind of an amalgamation of those things. And having the opportunity to experience so many different stories and get to play with so many different units in quick succession, right? That's what makes it, to me, so special. On top of the fact that you have like the introduction of tier 3 promotions for the first time, which was so cool. Bring back True Blades, bring back Gold Knights. There's so much cool stuff in Radiant Dawn. And the fact that we saw evolutions of the Laguz transformation system, one of the best, in my opinion, final bosses in the entirety of Fire Emblem, and what actually had like mechanics and specific things that you had to do to manage it other than just overpowering it with holy weapons. So cool. And the fact that you actually got to see your units that you had been raising in previous chapters as enemies on the battlefield that you then had to go and to deal with. Like, that is so freaking cool. I love so much about Radiant Dawn. I don't think I can put it in S tier. I don't, because things like the biorhythm system and the weird messed up difficulty and just how useless some units are if you don't baby the absolute hell out of them make it a little bit more frustrating to play, especially if you're not ready for it, if you're coming into it blind for the first time. But with how much time that I've put into it and how much I've experienced what it has to offer, especially with like consecutive playthroughs and being able to unlock characters and save different characters from different story things, you know what I'm talking about if you know what I'm talking about. It's awesome. To me, it's another A rank. I adore it. Radiant Dawn is the bomb, or Radiant Bomb is the dawn, I suppose. Thani Bomb. Boom. There's a reference for you. Moving on to the 3DS era with Fire Emblem Awakening. I actually just finished replaying Awakening very recently, including playing through the majority of the DLC. I own all of it, except for like Apotheosis, because I just don't have that kind of time on my hands. And it is just a solid game, man. Awakening is a very solid, fun experience. It is not my favorite in the series, though. That's partially because I prefer to play on hard mode, and Awakening has the controversial decision to include ambush reinforcements, i.e. enemy reinforcements that can spawn at the beginning of the enemy turn and immediately take an action to run towards your nearest squishy unit that they have spawned next to and immediately detonate them and lose you the fight. So, yeah, that alone is something that I absolutely despise and keeps it out of S tier for me. But Awakening recaptures that classic Fire Emblem feel while still doing so much different. The introduction of the pair-up mechanic for the first time, the return of child characters from all the way back in Genealogy, all of the different ways you could build units due to class changing with second seals, the fact that you could actually have like marriages occur and choose what characters are going to be in relationships with who, and really saw an evolution of so many classic systems in a way that I don't think anyone was really expecting. And, you know, we talk all the time about the fact that Awakening was a Hail Mary, a one last shot to really show what the Fire Emblem series had to offer before they potentially weren't able to make any more games again. And you can see that, absolutely. The fact that you have a world map that you can traverse, like with Sacred Stones and Echoes / Gaiden. The fact that there's kind of technically sort of a creature campaign. The fact that there's all of these different paralogs and xenologs and so many different maps with different varied objectives and fun things that you can do. The fact that you have like the falchion again from all the way back in Shadow Dragon, but in the hands of another. And the fact that Chrom and Lucina have access to Aether, Ike's signature ability. There's just so many different fun things to do in Awakening. And that's before you get to any of the fan service content, like all of the classic maps from past games in the series populated with characters from those games that have dialogue specific to them that is very indicative of their character and how they would be in a situation like this. The fact that you can, especially if you have the grinding DLC, just grind out massively overpowered characters to take on some of these crazy DLC fights. That you can go around and recruit other people's Robins. Hell, the fact that Robin exists. I know the whole like creator cameo character is a very controversial thing. The player avatar is a controversial thing in Fire Emblem nowadays. But Robin as a character was their own character, and it was cool just having a unit that you could customize so freely. And yes, I know Chris did that first in New Mystery of the Emblem, but Robin is really where that concept came to the fore for so many. And just say, this is my unit, right? This is how I choose to play. This is what I want them to do. This is the role that they're going to serve in my army. And that was so cool. It's not the most engaging experience, honestly. It sometimes has a little bit too much clunkiness and frustration, again, especially if you're talking about hard mode, enemy ambush spawns, and things like that. So I think in terms of the overall series, it's a solid B for me. It's not a bad entry point. It's not a bad game at all. But similar to Thasia, it does some stuff that can just get frustrating. Just the fact that pair up is so random. You can be pairing up for the stats and not want to kill a unit because you want to give the XP to someone else, and then your backup partner will come in and kill them, or you really desperately you're going to get attacked 5 times in a row, and you just need your partner to block one of them, just one, and you'll survive. And they absolutely refuse to do it. It adds another layer of RNG that can get frustrating. And we'll see the fact that they fixed that in Fates kind of shows that they know that was a problem. So there's a little gimmicky things here and there that make it not quite A rank, but it's still a great entry B for me. Moving on to Fates, and much as the stories of Fates kind of do need to be ranked separately, the gameplay absolutely needs to be ranked separately. We're going to start off with Birthright here, and for me, I've been waffling on this one because it almost feels cruel, but I think Birthright's got to go in D. And I think it's going to be our only entry in D, and we'll explain why. So Birthright is not a bad game, right? It's not, again, offensive. Like, I would play any of these games if someone asked me to. I love all the Fire Emblem games, but looking at the series as a whole and how much I enjoyed the gameplay experience of each of them, Birthright is the only game on this list that I've only completed once and really have no care to go through and play again. Things like Thasia and Mystery of the Emblem, I've only played once as well. However, I would like to replay them. Same thing for Genealogy. I started another playthrough of Genealogy at one point, never finished it, but I played Birthright once and was like, I'm good. It's fine. It's really easy and a little boring, and it really doesn't bring anything to the table for me that sets it apart, especially compared to the other entries in Fates, the other 2 campaigns. It kind of feels like a modern Shadow Dragon, wherein it's just kind of the bare bones experience of what a Fire Emblem can be in the modern day, and doesn't do anything special. But because it's not the first entry in the series, by a long shot, as evidenced by how many things are up on this list right now, it loses points. Shadow Dragon has the benefit of the doubt because it was the first one to do any of this, right? And that earns it a lot. Birthright doesn't have that. It does not have that leeway, and so I think it's got to be D rank. Again, it doesn't offend. It's just kind of blah and unmemorable. Like, I can't really distinctly remember any given map from Birthright. It's just there, and that sucks. It's a shame, but I don't really have anything else to say about it. D rank is where it is. Conquest, however, ooh boy, that's an S rank right there. No ifs, ands, or buts. I think before Engage came along and really blew my socks off in terms of gameplay, spoiler alert, that's going to be a pretty highly ranked one, Conquest was the epitome of the series for me in terms of sheer gameplay. And that's very much by design, and I don't think that's going to be a surprising statement because I feel like most long-term fans of the series feel the same way. Conquest was designed, as stated by Intelligent Systems, to satiate the desire from the hardcore fan base to have a tough game. A game where you had to consider all of your options, where you had to utilize all of the mechanics that were available to you, and where people wanted to have good, well-designed, clearly thought-out mechanics that were then given to the player to do with as we would. And Conquest comes through for that in spades. The battle in the harbor, where you're fighting off Takumi and you get Camilla for the first time, is one of the only times in Fire Emblem history where I was stonewalled for hours. I was playing on hard mode right off the bat. Conquest was my first Fates experience. It was the story that I chose to go for first because it's awesome. And man, I literally was stuck on it all day. And that does not happen to me in Fire Emblem, man. And that's when I knew that this was going to be an all-time experience. The way that you had to actually pay attention to every single character's personal skills. The way that there were certain characters that just weren't going to stand up to the challenge because they didn't have a good enough personal skill. They didn't have good enough stats. The fact that you actually had an interesting combination of units to play around with. The fact that every single map brought a new challenge to the fore and was kind of scary in a lot of ways. I kind of equate it to coming to a new area in a FromSoft game that you've never been to before. And you don't know what exactly awaits you, but you know it's roundly going to kick you in the ass. That's how Conquest felt for me. And it was awesome. I loved every single second of it. I really cannot praise the gameplay enough. And the fact that I'm legitimately afraid to do Conquest Lunatic mode should tell you everything that you need to know. It's an awesome experience, really strong, raw, tough gameplay, a just deep-seated need to draw out every ounce of strategic capability from the player. It's phenomenal. I can't get enough of it. I replay it whenever I feel like I have the mental fortitude to handle it because it's just that good. Conquest is excellent. Finally, we come to Revelation. And Revelation is a very interesting one. It is a game that I am more than happy to replay, unlike Birthright. However, the fact that so much unit balancing is so bad makes it difficult to do so because of some of the characters that I love in Fates. For those of you who don't know, Revelations allows you to actually play with both sides of the army. You will recruit both Norian and Hoshidan characters, kind of, randomly scattered throughout the campaign. And it makes for a very interesting gameplay experience because both sides have pros and cons. And you now kind of get to complement their strengths and weaknesses with one another. The issue is that unless it's one of the characters that you get at the very beginning of the game, pretty much only the royalty is usable. Like, there are levels where you will get a character. For example, partway through the game, I'd say at the midpoint, maybe 2/3 of the way through the game, Xander and Leo will join you, and they will bring with them their retainers. Xander and Leo are fairly high-level promoted units. Their retainers are like, what is it? Odin is something ridiculous like level 11. When every enemy that you're fighting, or nearly every enemy that you're fighting, is promoted, if not like level 20 unpromoted. It's a distinct level disadvantage. And outside of choosing one or two units that you're going to baby and actually get caught up in levels, a lot of the other characters in the game are just downright unusable because of that level disparity. And it's weird. It's really, really strange. I don't know if it's because IS intended you to just use the Royals, because this is the only game where you can get all of them together. And I mean, together they comprise a very strong fighting force, so like, why wouldn't you? Or if it's just bad balancing, but I hesitate to say that it's just bad balancing, seeing as how they knew exactly what they were doing with Conquest, since that was the game that they wanted to make a really good challenge. So I don't know. It's weird. I love Revelations because it brings both sides of the battle together. I love that it allows you to get all the various different types of weapons and resources in one castle. I love that it really lets you play around with all of the mechanics and all of the possibilities that the game has, and yet that weird balancing just makes it awkward. So I think it has to go in C tier. Because while it's really, to me, just that one decision that knocks it down a couple pegs, it's a huge decision. Because having a variety of units that you can use and utilize in whatever way you so choose to build different teams over the course of any given playthrough of a game is of massive value to me with Fire Emblem. It's one of the reasons I love the series so much, because of its replayability. And Revelation just doesn't feel like it has that. And it's a major disappointment. So, yeah, overall, the Fates games are a very mixed bag in terms of gameplay. I would argue that none of them is bad. Birthright and Revelation have their issues, and Conquest is awesome. But overall, what they brought to the table for Fire Emblem was very, very strong. The My Castle system that we've now seen in various different iterations ever since Fates came along, the way you can customize it, the multiplayer with it, all really fun. There were a good number of varied map types and objectives in all three games that I've really enjoyed. Just the fact that you get stuck for a little while having basically just Karin, Gunter, and your butler of choice based off of your chosen gender of Karin at the beginning of Revelation was interesting. It made things feel very desperate and scary, and I liked that. Even just the fact that each side had different types of units. And yeah, there were going to be some deficiencies in your formations because there were just Fire Emblem staples you really didn't have access to, which was, again, weird and interesting. And it kind of flipped the whole formula on its head. The way they played with skills, just there was a lot that you could do. Capturing enemies, something that we hadn't seen since Thasia 776 made a return, if, kind of in a little bit of a lackluster way. But the fact that you could capture enemies to then recruit and use was really cool. There was a lot of great stuff that Fates did. And it's a shame that its campaigns are kind of so across the spectrum of quality in terms of their gameplay, but Conquest is great, and Revelation and Birthright are still good for at least one playthrough, so it's not the worst. Finally, we have our last two entries, the Switch generation of Fire Emblem, starting with Three Houses. I adore Three Houses. I love it to death. I know there are people out there who criticize it because the map design or just make everyone Wyvern Rider's forehead. But to me, really raising your units in a way that no other Fire Emblem game allows you to do by specifically teaching them and tutoring them into the form that you wanted them to be was so cool. I loved the social systems of Garreg Mach. I know people got tired of it, and yeah, it can get draining. There's a reason that they scaled it back in Engage, I know, but I loved it in the moment. I still love it on replaythroughs of the game. The fact that there was so many different stories you could play with different maps, different objectives, different units that you could utilize unless you managed to recruit a few from another house, the different types of classes that were available, the multiple tiers of promotions like nothing we've ever seen before in the series. Three Houses did a ton of cool stuff. Hell, Gambits, being able to equip an actual squad to your units and having the closest thing to proper squad-based gameplay we have ever seen in a Fire Emblem game. It's just, there was a lot of really, really fun things in Three Houses that I hope we see refined and made better for future entries in the series, because there's some stuff that I miss from it. Just the fact that there were enemies that were huge that you had to damage specific sections of them to stun them and break certain attacks, or like you'd break their health bars and they'd get new attacks and become more dangerous. Like actual little mini bosses on the field was so cool. I love Three Houses for so much. And while it's certainly not an S rank, I think it belongs in A. It does a lot different. It does a lot good. It's got so much to offer for anyone who decides to delve into the series. And I think there's a reason that so many people use it as that kind of onboarding step, right? It's just phenomenal. It's got to be A tier. Oh, and I wanted to go back really quick. I just remembered this, but as I was about to start talking about Engage, the fact that Fates also refined the pair-up system to be way less RNG dependent, as I mentioned during Awakening and then forgot about when I started talking about Fates. But like actually having it like, no, you will guaranteed get a backup attack if you have two unpaired units or one unpaired unit doing an attack, and then a unit next to them will give a follow-up attack to help them out. Or if you're paired up to get the stats, every so many attacks you'll get a guaranteed block, so you can work around that, you can play around that. It made the system way better, and I kind of hope that we see pair up come back in the future in a similar fashion, because it added another strategic layer that I really appreciated. It felt way, way better than pair up in Awakening. They did a great job with that, so I wanted to just toss that into the Fates section before I forgot about it. Finally, Fire Emblem Engage. As much as I absolutely despise the story writing and some of the characters, goddamn if Engage isn't one of the best games in the series to play from a just pure gameplay perspective. Engage does everything right. It really does. Unit building is just complex enough, just deep enough while being so wide that it doesn't shatter gameplay balance. Every decision feels meaningful, and you have so many choices that you can play the game again and again and again and again and do different things every time and discover new favorite strategies and builds every time. The introduction of the emblems that I was so skeptical about gives you so much freedom to create different types of units and make any unit you want not just good, but great. And the fact that there are subclasses that make each other type of class have so much more capability and make them so much more valuable. I mean, armored units have never been better than they are in Engage, just because they're so much harder to actually deal with from a tactical standpoint because of their armored bonuses. Smash weapons actually allowing you to deal big damage and move enemy units around. Huge. So much better than the basic shove mechanic from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. The evolution of forging to include engraving to actually fix a particular type of weapon or a particularly deficient stat on a unit, buff them up, and really just complete what can otherwise be a clunky, difficult to use member of your army, the trimming down of the monastery into what it kind of just needed to be from a gameplay perspective, and then with a bunch of other side stuff that you can engage with if just that's your type of thing. The maps, the difficulty, it just feels so good, man. Like, I can't, there's not that much that I feel like I can really gush about it right now because I've done that so much on the channel already. It's well documented how much I love Engage's gameplay, but it really just is the cream of the crop. I can only hope that future entries in the series learn so much from what Engage has done and carries some of these new features forward. I want to see subclasses continue to be a thing with plenty of different expansions on the system. I want to see a skill inheritance system utilizing the framework of the emblems. You know, we don't have to have the emblems themselves, but just that way of inheriting skills, learning skills, and the types of skills that aren't just like luck-based, percentage-based off of stats, but quantifiable, either passives that are always active or skills that have a very clear-cut activation requirement that you can strategize around and plan for. A plethora of different staves that you can use to inflict status effects, block off parts of the map, move units around. It's just, there's so much, man. And I don't know if it's just because they got so much time to polish Engage, or if IS just really put their noses to the grindstone and hammered out some S+ tier gameplay. But Engage, just from a gameplay perspective, is probably the pinnacle of the series for me. Even amongst the S tier, Engage is the top, man. Like, if I'd had the forethought to have an S+ rank on here, I think that's where Engage would be. It's just a stellar experience from start to finish. Not talking about the Fells analog. The Fells analog is garbage, but at least on maddening. But Engage itself, 11 out of 10. We'll play it again forever and always. I adore it. And that, my friends, is the Fire Emblem gameplay tier list. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hopefully it's a little less controversial than the story tier list was. I have a feeling it will be. I don't think I'm too out of band with a lot of these choices. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below, of course, as always. If you have your own particular ranking that you would like to share, please do so. Or if you agree or disagree with something that I've placed somewhere on the tier list, let us know. Strike up a conversation, be respectful with each other, and be respectful towards me. I think some people have learned recently that as much as I am very understanding and very polite, if someone decides to come after me, I am not afraid to clap back aggressively. So be nice to me, be nice to your fellow commenters. Let's have some fun discussions in the comments, shall we? Probably going to be doing one more Fire Emblem tier list, I think probably on presentation, not necessarily graphical fidelity, but just how a game presents itself. And then at the end of that, we're going to do one final wrap-up of just what I think overall the best and worst Fire Emblems are, considering all of these different categories. So I hope you look forward to that, and I hope you enjoyed this one. For now, though, I'm going to wrap this one up here. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.